Okay, welcome to the video podcast for Chapter 9 dealing with the endocrine system. Just a sort of an overview of what the endocrine system does. It regulates our growth, um, it maintains homeostasis, and it does so using specialized structures called glands, which produce chemical signals called hormones that are um, sent into the bloodstream, and they're carried around the body by the beating action of the heart. And when they arrive at their target tissue, they bind to receptors on the membrane surface, and they cause that tissue to do a particular function, perform some sort of uh, series of responses that maintains homeostasis in the human body. So it exists as a counterpart to the nervous system. Now, um, as the second controlling system of the body, um, you might want to ask, well, why don't we simply use the nervous system for everything? And the answer is that the nervous system, while it's very good at what it does, it's designed to um, send and receive information, to maintain communication networks in the body. Um, However, the drawback is that it consumes a massive amount of energy, and if we were to hardwire every cell in the body directly up to the central nervous system, it would be logistically difficult because we would be a unimaginably large organism, and we would consume such large amounts of energy that we wouldn't be able to maintain that kind of demand on a day-to-day basis. So the endocrine system evolved as a counterpart to the nervous system as a method of maintaining homeostasis in the body by maintaining cell-to-cell signaling. It uses chemical messengers called hormones that are released into the blood, and these control several major processes such as reproduction, growth and development, mobilization of body defenses, maintenance of homeostasis, and regulation of metabolism. Hormones are produced by specialized cells in the endocrine system, which secrete them into the extracellular fluid, and the blood then carries them to the target sites. And these hormones regulate the activity of other cells. So, unlike the nervous system, which relies on close contact between the nerve cell and the target, in the endocrine system, the gland that controls the function that the endocrine system is trying to regulate may be quite some distance away from the target, but that's not a concern because the hormones are carried throughout the body in the bloodstream. So what determines whether or not the cell is going to respond to a particular hormone is whether or not it has the receptor for that hormone on its surface, and not by the distance it is away from that particular endocrine gland. Hormones are classified chemically as amino acid based, which includes proteins, peptides, and amines. These hormones are easily dissolved in water, and their receptors tend to be on the surface of the cell membrane of the target cell, while steroids, which are made from cholesterol, are hydrophobic. They have to be transported in the plasma by binding to special proteins that then transport them all the way to the target tissue, and the receptor for steroid hormones is actually inside the cell. The same is true for the catecholamine and epinephrine, and not epinephrine, I'm sorry, the catecholamines such as thyroxine, and their receptors are also inside the cell, and that's due to the fact that both thyroid hormone and steroid-based hormones are nonpolar. Prostaglandins are made from highly active lipids. The way that these hormones work is that they affect only certain tissues or organs, which are called targets. These cells have to have a specific receptor for that hormone on their surface in order to respond to that hormone. When the hormone binds to the receptor, what happens is that the receptor will change its shape, and the result will be a series of chemical reactions inside the cell that will change the way the cell looks and acts. It may cause the cell to begin to divide very rapidly. It may cause the cell to produce a particular protein that the body needs. Any number of things could happen as a result of the hormone binding to its appropriate receptor. Changes in the plasma membrane permeability or electrical state are one of the effects that are caused by hormones. By changes in permeability, what we mean is that as a result of binding to hormones, certain gates will open that will allow certain things either into or out of the cell. They can also cause a change in the membrane voltage, which can result in a variety of cellular responses. It can also cause the synthesis of proteins, such as enzymes, or the inactivation or activation of enzymes, again, depending on the hormone and the receptor that binds to it. It can also stimulate cell division and promote secretory activity. So there's a wide variety of things that a hormone can do. And you might think, okay, well, how is it that all these huge variety of different responses in target tissues can happen simply by binding to a receptor? And the answer is that the receptors have structures on the outside of the cell membrane that are capable of binding to the hormone, but inside the cell membrane what happens is that they can trigger any of a large variety of chemical reactions that result in all of these responses taking place, and we'll see exactly how that works in the next several slides. There's two mechanisms by which hormone acts. There's direct gene activation, in which the hormone actually causes molecules to enter the nucleus of the cell, whereupon they bind to particular genes and cause them to turn on and produce a specific protein product. Or they can work through what's called a second messenger system, and we'll see how each of these operate. So if we look at direct gene activation, a perfect example is the action of steroid hormone. Steroid hormones are a class of lipids that have a ring system that's based on the cholesterol molecule, and you can check in your textbook what the cholesterol molecule looks like, or you can Google it. But essentially, it's an extremely non-polar molecule, meaning that it doesn't have separation of charge on its surface. As a result, it passes very easily through cell membranes, and the receptor for steroid hormones are inside the cell cytoplasm, whereupon they bind to the steroid hormone and then they escort it into the nucleus. They bind to a specific protein within the nucleus, and then they bind to specific sites on the cell's DNA, and this activates genes and results in the synthesis of new protein. And so what I'd like you to do is take a listen to the mechanism of steroid action.
Steroid hormones are not water-soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
So, in non-steroidal hormones, we're talking about hormones that are polar, based on amino acids or peptides or amino acid derivatives. And in this class of hormones, what happens is that the hormone will bind to a membrane-bound receptor. The hormone does not enter the cell, but it sets off a series of reactions that activates an enzyme that will catalyze a reaction that produces a second messenger molecule such as cyclic AMP. Now, what do we mean by a second messenger? Well, the first messenger in this case is the hormone binding to the receptor. The second messenger is an active molecule on the cytoplasmic side of the membrane that will cause a particular protein to become activated as a result of triggering what we call a cascade inside the cell, in which cyclic AMP will activate a protein, that protein will activate another protein, and that protein will activate another protein. And at each step, what happens is that the signal grows geometrically, because each activated molecule can activate more than one molecule downstream of it in the cascade. And as a result, you can take a very tiny initial signal and blow it up significantly in a very short period of time. So these second messengers are essentially what initiate the cascade inside the cell. It oversees additional intracellular changes, and this promotes a specific response. So let's take a listen to how second messenger systems operate.
Peptide hormones influence their target cells without actually entering them. They bind to receptors on the target cell's plasma membrane. This will trigger one of a variety of responses. For example, epinephrine from the adrenal medulla binds to a receptor on the membrane of a liver cell. Epinephrine's effect on this cell will be the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. The binding of epinephrine to the receptor activates the enzyme adenylate cyclase, which converts ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP acts as a second messenger and sets off a cascade of reactions that activate a set of enzymes. In this cell, the enzymes catalyze the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, and glucose can be released from the cell.
Okay, what is it that controls hormone release? In other words, when does an endocrine gland know to secrete its products into the bloodstream? And one of the ways that it knows is by monitoring the composition of the blood. Hormone levels in the blood are usually maintained by negative feedback, where a stimulus or low hormone levels in the blood will trigger the release of more hormone. The hormone release stops once an appropriate level in the blood is reached. So as an example, we could take the example of the thyroid gland. Okay, so let's draw a thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is a little butterfly-shaped gland that sits right in front of your larynx or your voice box. And what it does is it produces a hormone called thyroxine, or T4. Okay? And what thyroxine does, as we'll find out shortly, is it accelerates the body's metabolic rate, meaning it speeds up the rate at which you burn your body's fat. So this tends to raise your body temperature, cut down on the amount of total body fat that you carry, and make you lean and mean. Now, the thyroid gland is stimulated to secrete when there are low levels of thyroxine in the blood. So what I'm drawing here is just uh, the larynx. Okay, this would be the Adam's apple. Okay, laryngeal cartilage, and there's your thyroid gland. And what happens when metabolic levels drop and thyroxine levels drop is that the gland itself will be stimulated by another hormone that's actually produced by a gland called the pituitary gland, which sits up here under the brain. So let me draw a little brain here for you. Okay, and this brain is connected to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland produces a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, in response to falling levels of thyroxine in the bloodstream. When that happens, when the thyroxine levels drop, the pituitary is stimulated to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That causes the thyroid to release more thyroxine, and what happens as a result is that the thyroxine levels begin to build up in the blood, and as that happens, your metabolism is sped up, but also the levels of thyroxine begin to build, and what this will do eventually is it'll feed back and inhibit the release of T4 from the thyroid gland, as well as the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary. Okay, so it acts at two levels, and it actually also impacts the hypothalamus, which is in charge of the pituitary gland, and inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, which is the signal for the pituitary gland to release TSH. So this is what we mean by negative feedback. We create conditions in the body that ultimately lead to a physiological state that shuts off the original command, and that's exactly what happens as a result of thyroid hormone levels dropping in the body. And we'll talk a little bit more about thyroxine a little bit later on in the lecture, but this is just to illustrate the point how negative feedback works. Okay. Hormonal stimuli of the endocrine system is the most common type. Endocrine glands are activated by other hormones. As an example, we can see here that the anterior pituitary hormones travel to target organs such as the thyroid gland, and this prompts the release of a particular hormone such as thyroid hormone. The hypothalamus secretes hormones that stimulate the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary in turn secretes a class of hormones that are called tropic hormones, and those are simply commands to other organs in the endocrine system to begin to secrete their respective hormone. And then as those levels begin to rise in the bloodstream, what will happen is eventually that will feed back and inhibit the action of both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, and that will result in the release of fewer tropic hormones, the suppression of the secretion of the target endocrine organs, and a return of the body to its original state. Humoral stimuli of the endocrine system is the result of changing blood levels, and certain components in the blood, such as electrolytes, can stimulate hormone release. Humoral indicates various body fluids such as blood and bile and interstitial fluid that can stimulate the action of a particular endocrine gland. As an example, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are produced in response to changing blood calcium levels. Insulin is produced in response to changing levels of blood glucose. So let's take the example here of the parathyroid glands, which are on the back of the thyroid. So we're looking at the rear end of the thyroid gland. Those are the parathyroid glands. And what happens as blood calcium drops is that that's a direct stimulus to the parathyroid glands to generate more parathyroid hormone. What this does is it steals calcium from the bones and absorbs more calcium from the digestive tract, and the result is that the blood calcium levels begin to rise. And once they get to a certain level, then the production of parathyroid hormone shuts off. The thyroid gland produces a hormone called calcitonin, which responds to increased levels of blood calcium by causing more deposition of calcium into the bone. So what happens as blood calcium levels begin to rise is that calcitonin is stimulated. It adds calcium to the bone. This reduces the blood calcium levels, and that ultimately leads to the thyroid's production of calcitonin shutting off. Nerve impulses can also stimulate the endocrine system. Most are under the control of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. As an example, the adrenal medulla is stimulated to release adrenaline as a result of a direct neural electrical stimulation of cells that live in the core of this gland, which sits on top of each kidney, and that causes it to secrete adrenaline directly into the blood capillaries, and from there it's carried through the entire body. The adrenal glands are interesting glands. There's actually two parts to the adrenal gland: the medulla, which is the core, and the cortex, which is the outer covering. The medulla is responsible for the production of epinephrine under the command of the sympathetic nervous system, while the cortex generates a whole host of hormones that regulate things such as our electrolyte balance, our blood sugar balance, and also the production of our sex steroids that control our secondary sex characteristics. This is a class of hormones known as androgens. So, we can take a tour here of the major endocrine organs, so show you where they're located. These include the pituitary and thyroid gland, the parathyroid and adrenal glands, the pineal and thymus gland, and the pancreas, as well as the ovaries and the testes, known as the gonads. The ovaries are found in women, the testes are found in men, and the hypothalamus, which is actually in charge of the entire endocrine system and sits just underneath the thalamus of the brain and above the pituitary gland. So we'll go through each of these organs one at a time and talk about where they're located, what they regulate, and what hormones they secrete. And what you'll have to know is, in every organ, the names of the hormones, what they do, and where the organ is that secretes them. So let's start our journey by looking at the pituitary gland. It's about the size of a pea, and it hangs by a stalk from the hypothalamus of the brain and is protected because it sits in the pituitary fossa of the sphenoid bone. It has two functional lobes. The anterior pituitary is glandular tissue, while the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue. It used to have the nickname the master endocrine gland because it secretes hormones that tell other endocrine organs what to do. But it turns out that that's a little bit of a mischaracterization of the pituitary gland, because the hypothalamus actually governs the action of the pituitary. In the anterior pituitary, this happens as a result of releasing hormones that are secreted into a capillary network that carries them to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to secrete this list of hormones here, given as a result of their name and their target and their action. And in the case of the posterior pituitary, it's actually an outgrowth of this part of the brain. The hormones produced by the posterior pituitary, which include vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, are actually generated in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary until they need to be secreted. In the case of the anterior pituitary, once it receives the chemical signal from the hypothalamus, depending on the nature of the chemical signal, it will release either the gonadotropins, which include follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormone that target the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female, thyroid-stimulating hormone, which targets the thyroid gland, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex and causes it to release cortisol. Other hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary include prolactin, which stimulates the milk letdown reflex and the production of milk by the breast tissue, and growth hormone, which controls the body's long bone and soft tissue growth. So massive amounts of growth hormone prior to puberty results in a condition known as gigantism, while massive amounts of growth hormone secreted after puberty cause an enlargement of the skull and the bones of the hands and the feet and the thickening of the long bones known as acromegaly. You want to see an example of somebody that suffers from both of those conditions, you can go out and rent The Princess Bride, and there was an actor in that movie called Andre the Giant. He used to be a professional wrestler, and he suffered from both acromegaly and gigantism. So if we look at the anterior pituitary first, there's 6 anterior pituitary hormones. 2 affect non-endocrine targets, and those include human growth hormone and prolactin, and 4 of them stimulate other endocrine glands, and these include thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, abbreviated ACTH, and the gonadotropic hormones FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. Characteristics of all anterior pituitary hormones are that they are peptides, meaning that their receptors are going to be on the cell membrane surface of the target cell. They act through second messenger systems that results from the hormone binding to the receptor on the target, resulting in a change in the shape of the receptor, which sets off a series of chemical reactions inside the target cell that ultimately results in the activation of a particular protein or perhaps the production of a novel gene product. They're regulated by hormonal stimuli, mostly negative feedback. So as the anterior pituitary produces a particular hormone, its level in the bloodstream will rise. As the level in the bloodstream rises, what will happen is that will be a signal back to the anterior pituitary to eventually shut off, to quit producing the hormone because it's no longer needed. Growth hormone is a major metabolic hormone. Its effects are directed to the growth of skeletal muscle and long bone as well as soft tissue, and it plays a role in determining the body's final size. It causes amino acids to be assembled into protein, so it is an anabolic hormone, and it causes fats to be broken down to be used as a source of energy. So this causes you to become leaner and meaner. And here you can see an example of a growth hormone series of growth hormone disorders. Pituitary dwarfism, shown here on the left, results from an undersecretion of growth hormone during childhood. As a result, the long bones don't reach their typical adult length. Gigantism results from hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood, resulting in a drastic enlargement of the long bones. And acromegaly results from hypersecretion of growth hormone during adulthood, and this causes the long bones to thicken and the bones of the hands, feet, and face to broaden as well. And so you get a characteristic set of facial features in most acromegalic individuals. Prolactin stimulates and maintains milk production during childbirth. Its function in males has yet to be described. Adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex. Thyroid stimulating hormone influences the growth and the activity of the thyroid gland. So in both of these, okay, what does prolactin do? It stimulates milk production. In females, what does adrenocorticotropic hormone do? It causes the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. And what does thyroid stimulating hormone do? It stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone called thyroxine. Gonadotropic hormones regulate the activity of the gonads. In the male, that's the testes, and in the female, that's the ovaries. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates follicle development in the ovaries. Now you might say, well, what in the world is a follicle? A follicle is a chamber inside the ovary in which an egg sits, waiting for an appropriate sequence of events to both mature and to be ovulated, meaning to be shot out of the follicle and out of the ovary and to be sucked into the fallopian tube, which is the tube that connects the ovary to the uterus. Luteinizing hormone is different. It stimulates ovulation of the egg in females and also the development of a structure called the corpus luteum, which is what is left over of the follicle after the egg pops out of it in the female. So that's where the name comes from. Now in males, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates sperm development in the testes, while luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone production, which in turn stimulates sperm production as well. Okay, so in males, these really are not properly named. The male doesn't have a corresponding structure like a follicle in a female ovary, and he doesn't produce a corpus luteum like the follicle turns into after the egg pops out in the female. So just be aware that those names primarily apply to structures in the female reproductive system, although both of these hormones have an effect on the male gonads as well. Hormonal release is regulated by releasing and inhibiting hormones produced by the hypothalamus. And so what this is basically the on and off switch for the rest of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus produces two hormones which are transported to the neurosecretory cells of the posterior pituitary, and these include oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which is sometimes abbreviated ADH or sometimes called vasopressin. The posterior pituitary is not strictly an endocrine gland, but it does release hormones that are actually synthesized in the hypothalamus. If we look at the posterior pituitary in a little bit more detail, oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions during labor and sexual relations, and also stimulates the milk letdown reflex, which causes smooth muscle to eject milk into the nipple, and this helps the baby nurse. And as a result, the baby can get nutrition during its first few years of neonatal development, right after it comes out of the womb. And so here you can see the hypothalamic nuclei, the nerve cells that actually manufacture the hormones. They're called neurosecretory cells, and they store the hormones in the axon terminal, and then when the appropriate levels of hormone or of components in the arterial blood reach the posterior pituitary, the neurosecretory cells are stimulated to secrete their hormones directly into the capillary beds, and this carries them throughout the body. The antidiuretic hormone targets the kidney tubules and causes them to retain more water, so your urine volume will go down. That's why it's called an antidiuretic hormone. It does the opposite of what a diuretic does. And oxytocin stimulates the mammary glands as well as the uterine muscles, so it aids in childbirth and in the milk letdown reflex. Okay, now antidiuretic hormone is also produced by the posterior pituitary gland, and it's designed to control our body's water balance. So it will either promote the production of more concentrated urine if it's secreted in excess, or it promotes the concentration of dilute urine if small amounts of it are secreted. It inhibits urine production by promoting water reabsorption by the kidneys, and in large amounts causes vasoconstriction. And these two effects, the vasoconstriction and the increase in blood volume due to the increase in water retention by the kidneys, leads to an increase in blood pressure. This hormone is also known as vasopressin. Remember that ADH, just like oxytocin, is manufactured in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary until the changes in blood osmolarity signal the hypothalamus to release the ADH into the bloodstream. And that causes the osmolarity of the blood, basically the concentration of solutes in the blood, to drop and sets things back to normal homeostatic values. Now, the thyroid gland is located in front of the neck. It's a major metabolic hormone composed of two active iodine-containing hormones. The two primary thyroid hormones are T4, also known as thyroxine, which is secreted by the thyroid follicles, and T3, which is also secreted by the thyroid follicles by conversion of T4 at the target tissues. And it's the T3 that's actually the more active form of the hormone. And what does thyroid hormone do? It basically accelerates the metabolic rate, so it tends to increase the rate at which you burn fat. It increases the body temperature and causes the heart rate and the respiratory rate to increase. In situations in which the thyroid gland becomes either over or underactive, it can enlarge, and this is a condition called goiter. If it's due to an underactivity of the thyroid gland, a lack of iodine can cause it to enlarge because it works so hard trying to build a hormone that it doesn't have the building blocks for, that the gland itself will begin to swell. Salt contains iodine in order to prevent this type of condition happening. The only place that you see goiters predominant around the world are in third world countries where they haven't added iodine to their salt to use as a condiment with their food. Cretinism is caused by a lack of thyroxine during early development in utero and also in postnatal development. The results are a diminished IQ, an increase in body weight and short stature, and defects in the nervous system. If this happens during childhood, okay, after the child is born, and we have a lack of thyroxine secretion, this can promote dwarfism. Thyroid hormone disorders such as myxedema are caused by an underactive thyroid in adult, and it results in physical and mental sluggishness. Graves' disease is another example of a thyroid condition that's caused by an autoantibody that recognizes thyroid gland receptors and basically locks the thyroid gland into an on position. This results in increased metabolic rate, heat intolerance, rapid heartbeat, weight loss, and exophthalmos. And you can see an example of exophthalmos here in this diagram. The eyes bulge from the head as a characteristic of hyperactive thyroid. Now, calcitonin is a hormone that has the opposite effect of parathyroid hormone. Decreases in blood calcium levels it decreases blood calcium levels by causing deposition on bone. It's antagonistic to parathyroid hormone, and it's produced by the parafollicular cells, which are between the follicles in the thyroid gland. And you can see parafollicular cells here and here and here. They are found between the follicles, and these two hormones together act to regulate your blood calcium overall. Essentially what happens when your blood calcium levels rise to dangerous levels is that this will trigger a decrease in the secretion of parathyroid hormone and an increase in the secretion of calcitonin. The result is that your blood calcium levels will drop and homeostasis will be restored. If your blood calcium levels were to drop too low, this will trigger an increase in parathyroid hormone secretion, and a decrease in calcitonin secretion, this will liberate calcium from the bone and cause your blood calcium levels to go up. Your parathyroid glands are tiny masses on the back of the thyroid that secrete parathyroid hormone, which stimulates osteoclasts to dissolve bone. Remember that the osteoclasts are the bone dissolvers and the osteoblasts are the bone builders. So when the osteoclasts are active, calcium is freed from the bone and released into the blood. And when osteoblasts are active, calcium is taken from the blood and put into the compact bone. It stimulates the kidneys and intestine also to absorb more calcium, and this results in an elevation of calcium levels in the blood. And so here you can see the seesaw effect between parathyroid hormone and calcitonin that keeps our blood calcium around 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. So a rising blood calcium level will stimulate the increase in calcitonin secretion. This stimulates calcium deposit at the bone by increasing osteoblast activity. By the same token, a drop in calcium levels in the blood will stimulate the parathyroid glands to secrete parathyroid hormone. This stimulates the osteoclast to dissolve bone, and this releases more calcium into the blood and helps to maintain our blood calcium at right around 10 milligrams per 100 mils. Your adrenal glands are located on top of each kidney, just like a pair of baseball hats. There's two regions in the kidney, the adrenal cortex, which is the outer glandular region, which has three separate layers within it. And these three separate layers are called the mineralocorticoid secreting area, the glucocorticoid, and the sex hormone secreting area. Okay, the way I remember these is by the acronym SALT, sugar, sex. The hormones that are predominantly produced by these three layers of the cortex have different purposes. The mineralocorticoid secreting area produces primarily aldosterone, which is our salt retaining hormone. When it's secreted, what it does is it stimulates the kidneys to retain sodium and excrete potassium. The glucocorticoid secreting area produces hormones such as cortisol and cortisone, which have as their primary effect the elevation of blood sugar. They're also secreted in response to stressful situations. And then the inner layer is responsible for the secretion of androgens, and these are hormones that are similar in activity to testosterone. And so what they do is they increase lean muscle mass, they increase hematocrit and bone density, and they also accelerate basal metabolic rate. The medulla is the core of the adrenal gland, and it's made up of neural tissue, and its primary hormone is adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. And what it does is it raises your blood pressure, raises your blood glucose level. It also increases your heart rate and your respiratory rate, and it acts along with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system to facilitate the fight or flight response. So this is one of the reasons why when you panic, not only does your sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system fire and produce all these effects that we talked about earlier in the lecture in the body, elevation of blood glucose and blood pressure, decrease in urine output, pupillary dilation, gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis at the liver to raise blood glucose levels, increase heart rate and respiratory rate, all that we think of as part of the actions of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. But it also stimulates the adrenal medulla to secrete massive amounts of adrenaline into the blood, and this is why the panic response does not abate immediately after the threat is perceived to have subsided. Okay, the adrenal cortex produces different sets of hormones in different layers. Mineralocorticoids, which are secreted by the outer layer of the cortex, are characterized by hormones such as aldosterone. They regulate the mineral content of the blood, and they regulate the water and electrolyte balance in the body. Their target organ is the kidney, and their production is stimulated by renin, which is produced by the kidneys, and aldosterone, which is, of course, produced by the adrenal cortex. Production is inhibited by atrionatriuretic peptide, which has as its bottom line overall effect a reduction in blood pressure and blood volume. And so you can see here how this hormonal axis works. Essentially, when there is a perceived stress, what will happen is that the hypothalamus will produce adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone will stimulate the adrenal cortex, and among other hormones that it will produce, increased production of mineralocorticoids will result in enhanced secretion of aldosterone, which targets the kidney tubules, and this increases the absorption of sodium in water and the excretion of potassium at the level of the kidney. If we look here at a different stimulus, such as a drop in sodium or increase in potassium in the blood, this can directly stimulate the cortex to produce aldosterone to offset this change in blood chemistry. A decrease in blood volume and blood pressure will also stimulate the production of renin, which has an indirect stimulating effect by promoting the synthesis of angiotensin II, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to generate the mineralocorticoid aldosterone, which will result in increased sodium retention and increased potassium secretion by the kidneys. Increased blood pressure and blood volume will cause atrionatriuretic peptide to be secreted, and this will have an inhibitory effect on the adrenal cortex. The result is reduced secretion of aldosterone, decreased secretion of potassium, and increased secretion of sodium. And the result is going to be that the water will follow the sodium into the urine and out of the body. The blood volume will go down and the blood pressure will go down. Glucocorticoids, including cortisone and cortisol, are produced by the middle layer of the adrenal cortex, and they promote normal cell metabolism, and they help resist long-term stress. And they're generally released in response to increased blood levels of adrenocorticotropic hormone. So you can see here an example of how this operates. We have a stressor, okay? This might be a fight or flight response. This could be a number of different things. What will happen is that the stressor will promote the hypothalamus to produce corticotropin releasing hormone. That will be carried by capillaries to the anterior pituitary, which will stimulate the release of ACTH, which will target the adrenal cortex and stimulate, as we already saw, the production of mineralocorticoids, but also the production of glucocorticoids. What this causes to happen is for proteins and fats to be turned into glucose or broken down for energy. This increases your blood sugar levels, but it also has the long-term effect of suppressing the immune system. Short-term stress responses that result from this same stimulus reaching the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is that the adrenal medulla is stimulated to release epinephrine. This causes the heart rate and the blood pressure to go up. This promotes production of sugar by the liver through gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. Also dilates the bronchioles. Changes in blood flow patterns lead to increased alertness and decreased digestive and kidney activity. We also see an increased metabolic rate. So you can see, in a way, that the stimulation of the adrenal medulla by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and the simultaneous stimulation of the adrenal cortex by the anterior pituitary via ACTH complement each other, because they both serve to elevate blood glucose levels, increase the overall energy content of the blood and oxygen content, and this helps us prepare for the fight or flight response, our ability to deal with the stressful situation at hand. Now, the effect on mineralocorticoid secretion is the release of aldosterone, which causes the kidneys to retain sodium and water, this increases blood volume and increases blood pressure, and this also complements the action of epinephrine because the increase in blood volume and blood pressure means more blood gets delivered to the muscle and we're able to deal with our fight or flight situation. The sex hormones are produced by the inner layer of the adrenal cortex as well as by the gonads. In males, that's the testes, and in females, those are the ovaries. Small amounts are made throughout life. They are mostly androgens, which are hormones that are similar to testosterone, but there are some estrogens that are also formed by this inner layer of the adrenal cortex. So we have two sources of sex steroids, the adrenal cortex and also the gonads. Adrenal cortex disorders that can affect their function include Addison's disease, that results from a hyposecretion of all adrenocortical hormones. This causes the skin to bronze, the muscles to become weak, and also cause you to become susceptible to infection. And that's because these increased levels of cortisone and cortisol have the effect of suppressing the inflammatory response and also, in the long run, suppressing the immune system. The problem with a lack of production of the other adrenocortical hormones, aldosterone and the androgens, tend to weaken the muscles, tend towards atrophy, and the inability of the immune system to respond to infection is what makes us now susceptible to increased possibility of disease. Hyperaldosteronism can result from an ACTH-releasing tumor. This results in excess water and sodium being retained, and it leads to high blood pressure and edema. Okay, the results can be increased risk of heart attack and stroke, and the solution is to remove the tissue that's hypersecreting this particular hormone. Other adrenal cortex disorders include Cushing's disease, which results from a tumor in the middle cortical area of the cortex. This results in an oversecretion of cortisone and cortisol, leading to a condition known as moon face or buffalo hump on the upper back. Also leads to hypertension and hyperglycemia, weakening of the bones, and depression. Masculinization results from hypersecretion of sex hormones due to a tumor in the inner layer of the adrenal cortex. We see a male pattern of hair growth. We also see an increase in lean muscle mass and hematocrit, and a decrease in overall body fat, and an increase in metabolic rate. So here you can see the adrenal medulla, okay, broken down. It lies below the adrenal cortex, under the cortex and the capsule, and it's basically modified neural tissue. It produces catecholamines. The two catecholamines are epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. These hormones prepare the body to deal with short-term stress. This is what we call the fight or flight response, by increasing the heart rate and blood pressure and the blood glucose levels. It also dilates the small passageways of the lungs, and what this does is increases oxygen delivery to the lungs and therefore to the blood. And as a result, what happens is that we have both an increased oxygen content and fuel content in the blood to deal with the stressful situation at hand. So again, to review, right? The mineralocorticoid secreting area, the glucocorticoid secreting area, and the sex hormone secreting area, the three layers of the cortex that lie under the protective capsule, and then the medulla, which are the modified neurons that secrete adrenaline directly into the bloodstream. Okay, and you've got one of these on top of each kidney. Okay, your pancreas is an unusual gland. It's what we might call a switch hitter, meaning that it has both an exocrine and an endocrine function. The exocrine function of the pancreas is to secrete digestive enzymes that help us chemically break down the food that we eat so that we can break it into small enough molecules that we can absorb it directly into the bloodstream, deliver it from there to the liver, and the liver in turn will either store it for later use or will allow it to pass to the rest of the tissues in the body in order to serve as fuel. The endocrine function of the pancreas is to regulate our blood sugar levels, and it does this through the action of two hormones, insulin and glucagon. Insulin allows glucose to cross the plasma membrane into cells, and this allows the cells to use it for energy. Glucagon allows an increase in blood glucose levels when the sugar level in the blood drops. Okay, so these are two hormones that act opposite each other. Insulin is secreted when blood glucose levels are high, and glucagon is secreted when blood glucose levels are low. Okay, so insulin is what's called a hypoglycemic hormone, and glucagon is what's called a hyperglycemic hormone. They are antagonists that help maintain blood sugar homeostasis. And so if we look at some pancreatic tissue, what you see is that you've got a whole lot of exocrine tissue. Essentially what these are cross-sections of secretory cells and their lumens, and what happens is that they produce digestive enzymes that eventually enter the pancreatic duct and will enter the first section of the small intestine known as the duodenum to help with the chemical digestion of food. And then these pale colored areas are what are called islets, and the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans produce the insulin, while the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans produce the glucagon. And if we look in on a close-up of a drawing of this part of the slide, you can see the beta cells secreting insulin into the capillaries, and here you can see also the alpha cells, okay, and they'll secrete glucagon into the capillaries when blood glucose levels begin to fall. And they're of course surrounded by exocrine pancreatic cells. Okay, so your pancreas is both an exocrine organ and an endocrine organ. Remember that an exocrine organ is an organ that secretes its contents into a tube called a duct, which leads to an open chamber inside another organ or onto the surface of a tissue, whereas an endocrine gland directly secretes its products into the bloodstream through some form of active transport. And here you can see the seesaw relationship that exists between insulin and glucagon when our blood sugar changes. So here we have a normal balance of blood glucose, which is about 90 milligrams per 100 mils. And what can happen after we eat a meal is that our blood sugar level will begin to rise as the sugars in the meal are broken down into simple sugars and are absorbed directly across the lining of the small intestine and into the bloodstream. And from there, those simple sugars are going to be carried directly to the liver. Okay, what will happen as the blood sugar levels rise is that this will signal the pancreas to secrete insulin. And what the insulin will do is it'll signal the liver to engage in glyconeogenesis. And so basically what happens is that we take simple sugars, simple glucose molecules, and hook them together in a polymer, and the liver will store that for use later as fuel. It'll also enhance uptake of glucose from the blood in our body cells to use for energy. Okay, so this is the signal that there is energy available and that the body's tissues should take advantage of it by transporting it into the cytoplasm to use as energy in the form of ATP. What will happen as a result is eventually the blood glucose levels will begin to drop as the glucose is converted into glycogen and stored in the liver. That glucose will become unavailable for energy, and as the tissue cells use the glucose for energy, the blood glucose levels will begin to drop. And as a result, what will happen eventually is that the blood glucose levels will return to normal values, back down to 90 milligrams per 100 mils, and then we'll wait now for the next change in blood glucose. Now, if we're talking about the body's situation between meals when we're not eating, what will happen over time is that our blood sugar levels will naturally drop due to the consumption of glucose in the blood as cells continue to metabolize. And at some point, what will happen is that blood glucose levels will drop um, to lower levels, okay, low blood sugar levels, significantly below 90 milligrams per 100 mils. And um, what this will do is this will stimulate the pancreas to secrete glucagon, which will stimulate the liver to break down glycogen to generate glucose to send into the blood. It'll also promote a separate process in the liver, which is the conversion of fat into glucose to be sent to cells to be used as energy. The result is that the blood glucose levels will rise and we'll head back up to our normal levels. Now, the pineal gland is located 180 degrees opposite the pituitary gland on the back of the brainstem. It's found on the third ventricle of the brain, and it secretes a hormone called melatonin. And this helps with our body's circadian rhythm. Basically, it's part of what tells us to be active when it's bright outside and to be inactive when it's dark. It's also thought to coordinate fertility in humans, although the research on that um, is still under debate. Okay, so take that with a grain of salt. But we do know that that melatonin levels tend to rise at night and they tend to fall during the daytime, and this is part of what we think contributes to its role in our circadian rhythm. And if you think about why this is an adaptive behavior that will increase our ability to survive, just imagine what would happen if you were constantly active in the dark and not active very much when it was light outside. You might become an easy victim to an accidental death or to consumption by a predator. Okay, if we're talking about something like a rabbit or a mouse or something that would be a good prey item. And so humans began evolution as something very similar to that. So these circadian rhythms were established to reduce our activity levels at night when we're vulnerable to attack or to accidental death, and to increase our activity levels when it's light out so that we could see, so that we could do things like build shelter and gather food in conditions that are going to promote the successful completion of those tasks. The thymus gland is located right behind the sternum and right in front of the heart. It's at its largest in infants and children, and it produces hormones called thymosins and thymopoietins. It's the site of maturation of T cells, which are part of your body's immune system. Your T cells are important because they help us fight disease by stimulating the reproduction of a type of white blood cell called a B lymphocyte, which secretes antibodies designed to attack and destroy the invader, and it also promotes the maturation of cytotoxic T cells, which are a special type of lymphocyte that shows up where pathogens try to invade the body or where diseased tissue is located and destroy it using a special type of chemical attack. So it's a very important place for the immune system to develop. So these T cells, without them, we would have a much higher susceptibility to infection and disease. We'll talk more about your immune system in subsequent chapters, but remember that once the T cells have matured inside the thymus, what they'll do is they'll move out and populate the rest of the lymphatic tissues of the body, things like your spleen and your lymph nodes, your tonsils, your Peyer's patches. There's lymphatic tissue all over the body, strategically placed at areas where it's likely to encounter pathogens. And once that happens, once these T cells graduate, essentially, the thymus will begin to shrink and decrease its production of thymosins and thymopoietins. They're not needed anymore after that point. And eventually, it'll just become a mass of scar tissue right behind the sternum. So this is a process called involution. The gonads come in two flavors. The ovaries are found in females, and they produce eggs, and two groups of steroid hormones, estrogens and progesterone. And what these do is they regulate the ovarian and the uterine cycles. The ovarian cycle is the timing of when an egg will pop out of the ovary, enter the oviduct, and make it to the uterus. And the uterine cycle is the monthly thickening of the lining of the uterus with tissue that's engorged in blood in order to support the development of a newborn. Okay, and this happens as a result of an interaction between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and of course the gonads themselves. And this happens in a monthly cycle. The testes are found in males and they produce sperm as well as androgens such as testosterone. And what testosterone does is it increases your lean muscle mass, it promotes sperm production, it increases your hematocrit, it increases your basal metabolic rate, and essentially it also indirectly increases your bone density. So a lot of good things come as a result of testosterone activity. Keep in mind that when we're talking about males and females, that both males and females make estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. It's just that in males, the testosterone is the dominating hormone, whereas in females, the estrogens and the progesterone are the dominating hormone. Estrogens stimulate the development of secondary female sex characteristics such as breast development, milk production, and body shape, increase in body fat. They also cause the female reproductive organs to mature. With progesterone, estrogens also promote breast development and regulate the menstrual cycle, which is part of the uterine cycle that we were talking about earlier. Progesterone acts along with estrogen to bring about the menstrual cycle, and it helps in the implantation of an embryo into the uterus, and it also helps prepare the breasts for lactation, and this is what the infant will use for fuel for the first few months of neonatal development after its birth. It'll breastfeed. The testes produce several androgens, but testosterone is the most important and potent one, and it's responsible for adult male secondary sex characteristics. It promotes the growth and maturation of the male reproductive system, and it's required for sperm cell production. Other hormone-producing tissues and organs include portions of the small intestine, the stomach, the kidneys, the heart, and other areas that have scattered endocrine cells in them. We'll touch on those in just a bit. So let's look at one type of tissue that acts as a temporary endocrine organ in the female, and this is the placenta. It produces hormones that help maintain pregnancy. The main hormone is a hormone called human chorionic gonadotrophin, and it signals a special structure inside the ovary, the ovary called the corpus luteum, to continue to produce hormones that will help maintain the lining of the uterus called the endometrium. Okay, these hormones are estrogen and progesterone. Some hormones play a part in the delivery of the baby as well. The production of human chorionic gonadotropin, in addition to estrogen, progesterone, and other hormones, is important for the reproductive cycle. Okay, it's the interplay of the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the gonads that allow the ovaries and the uterus to properly coordinate their activity. And by way of illustration, every month what will happen is that one or the other ovary in the female will be stimulated by a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone to cause one of these follicles, which are a chamber inside which a single egg lives, to mature. What will happen as the follicle matures is it'll begin releasing estrogen and to a lesser extent progesterone, and what this will cause to happen is for changes in the uterus to take place. What will occur during the follicular phase is that the uterine lining will begin to proliferate. The amount of cells in the lining will increase. Eventually what will happen is that as the follicle continues to be stimulated, eventually what will happen is that it will mature and the egg will pop out. That's called ovulation, and will be sucked into the fallopian tube and will start its trip towards the uterus. Now, if there's sperm in the area, what will happen is that the sperm will fertilize the egg, produce a zygote, and that essentially is the start of a new human life. In the meantime, the corpus luteum will begin producing progesterone, and this will cause the lining of the uterus to further thicken and engorge with blood and also with other nutrients, and that will prepare the uterine lining for the implantation of the developing zygote, which by the time it gets to the uterus will actually be a hollow ball of cells called the blastocyst. What will happen next is that the blastocyst will implant into the uterine lining, and at that point, a structure called the chorion will begin to develop. And it's the chorion which will produce the human chorionic gonadotropin, which is what we detect in human pregnancy tests, establishing that you have, in fact, conceived, that will tell the corpus luteum to continue secreting estrogen and progesterone in order to maintain the uterine lining for the first 1.5 trimesters of the pregnancy. So in a pregnant woman, you've got really 2 extra endocrine organs during the early part of the pregnancy. You've got the chorion, which is part of the embryo, and then you've also got the corpus luteum, which is inside the ovary. Okay, and what they're doing is communicating with each other in order to try and bring the pregnancy to a successful conclusion. Most endocrine organs operate smoothly until old age, and as with all the other body systems, as we get older, the ability of the endocrine system to do its job begins to diminish. Menopause is brought about by a lack of efficiency in the ovaries due to the fact that in the female, as the months go by and she ages and the eggs continue to be ovulated and the uterine cycle and ovarian cycle complete at the end of each month, what happens is that the total number of eggs as well as the total number of follicles in the ovary begins to decline. As a result, what happens is that the ability of the ovary to produce estrogen dramatically drops when the last egg leaves the ovary, and that's what menopause is defined as. At that point, the estrogen comes to a much lesser extent from the ovarian tissue because there's not as many follicles there to produce the hormone, and also we have to rely a little bit on the adrenal cortex. So one of the things that happens with reduced estrogen production is that osteoporosis is promoted. So one of the things that we do for women who are postmenopausal is that we often give replacement hormone in order to compensate now for the ovaries' loss of estrogen production in order to, among other things, maintain bone mass. Growth hormone production also declines as we get older, and as a result our metabolic rate slows down and we become less able to repair injuries, less able to defend ourselves against disease, and also we quit generating new tissue. Our muscle mass drops, our fat stores increase as a percentage of body weight, and our overall energy consumption and energy production go down. Many endocrine glands decrease their output as we get older. By the time a man is 50, he's lost over half of the testosterone production from the testes, and this is why you've probably seen commercials on TV or heard them on the radio for a condition known as low T, for men that have experienced the normal decrease in testosterone production that age brings about. If we replace the missing testosterone, in many cases what will happen is that we'll see an increased utilization of energy. This will decrease our body fat and increase our muscle mass. It'll also increase our hematocrit and our bone density, and it'll have positive effects on our overall health up to a certain point. Obviously, if you abuse this, then what can happen is that we can begin to see negative effects on organ systems such as the nervous system. Okay, please make sure to study this material in the chapters in your book. As you listen to the podcast, make sure and pause and take notes along the way. Remember that this material will be covered on both the lab and lecture exams coming up very shortly, and I'll see everybody in class. Thank you.